Well, good afternoon and welcome to this new installment of Indo-Pacific Partners, a webinar series of the National Security College. My name is Frédéric Grare and I will moderate this session. Indo-Pacific Partners, as you know, brings together experts from Australia and France to exchange on issues of common interest for the two countries. Today's session will discuss Chinese coercive policies vis-à-vis Taiwan. Well, saying that the Taiwan issue assumes an increasingly international dimension in a context of growing China-US rivalry is not exactly breaking news, nor is the fact that the crisis in the Taiwan Strait would impact more than China, Taiwan, and the US. Australia and Europe, like the rest of the world, are deeply aware that the cross-strait crisis would have direct political, security, and economic implications for themselves. But the issue is often presented in a binary way. Inversion versus status quo, black and white, when there are in fact many shades of gray. In effect, China is slowly but effectively stepping up pressure against Taiwan. Its coercive toolkit is vast, and it includes both kinetic and non-kinetic measures. So indeed, is a gradation of Chinese coercion more probable today than the outbreak of a war invasion? If so, how is the gradation likely to operate? Obviously, Australia's and Europe's potential response are a function of what they identify these different scenarios of evolution of the Taiwan Strait to be. So to discuss this, we have today four outstanding speakers. Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel is the Director for International Studies of the Paris-based Institut Montaigne. And he has had a long exposure to China and Taiwan, where he is currently based. He also has a long think tank experience. Dr. Mark Harrison is Senior Lecturer in Chinese Studies in the School of Social Sciences in the College of Art, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. He is also an expert associate at the National Security College and a founding fellow of the Australian Centre on China and the World at the ANU. Susan Dietz Anderson is Senior Executive Advisor China at the National Security College, and she had a long experience on China matters through both a combination of diplomatic assignments as well as work in the private sector in China too. And I need not present Professor Rory Metcalfe, who is head at the National Security College and has had a long career spanning diplomacy, academia, intelligence, journalism, and think tank. Thank you all for being with us for this session. Pleasure. Now, for the audience, each of the four speakers will present his view for about 10 minutes before we engage in a dialogue with the audience. And if you wish to comment or ask a question, please click on the chat button and write your question, which will then be asked to the panelists. And with those words, let's now turn to the substance of this meeting. Dr. Mathieu Duchâtel, how does France, or do you as a French, see the possible scenarios of Chinese coercions on Taiwan unfolding?
Thank you very much, Dr. Grare. Thanks to the National Security College for inviting me. I think there's been always a mix of coercion and incentives in China's Taiwan policy, as long as there have been cross-strait relations. So since the end of the 1980s, when all restrictions were lifted, where many restrictions were lifted by the Taiwanese side, this mix of coercion and incentives has come together. Xi Jinping has changed the balance between incentives and coercion. There has been clearly more coercion, as you can see from the permanent presence of the PLA Air Force and some Navy ships in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. In the aftermath of Taiwan's election last January, what we observe right now is a refocus on united front strategies after the visit by Mathieu and some KMT legislators to China. I mean, there is clearly a re-emphasis on softer elements of China's Taiwan policy. And I think that's the starting point here, where we are right now in terms of the dynamic in cross-strait relations to identify what are the key risks of coercion going forward. The election in Taiwan has given birth again to a divided government. The executive branch does not hold a majority in parliament. This is creating opportunities for China to try and influence the outcomes of Taiwan's governance and to try and neutralize or paralyze the executive branch in government. This is not going to be easy, but that's really a new element in this year of 2024. And I think we should start with that and keep that in mind. There will be a strong focus in China's Taiwan policy on trying to neutralize the executive branch in the next 4 years. But we should not lose sight of the coercive elements, because the coercive elements will stay, and China's Taiwan policy is already coercive. I have this recent report for Institut Montaigne in which I explore two scenarios of intensified coercion in the coming 4 years. And the reason why I wrote this paper is because speaking with interlocutors in Europe, in France and in Europe, in governments, but also in the private sector, in the media, it's very obvious that there has been an intense focus on the risk of war since the Chinese military response to the Pelosi visit to Taiwan in August 2022. I think it's important to get prepared to the worst case scenario, but I think this extreme focus on the risk of war should not lead us to lose sight on what is really happening on the coercive side of China's Taiwan policy. And also, we should be aware that the risk of war is part of what is usually called by experts cognitive operations by the PRC that affect our perceptions and especially our risk perception. So let me go through very quickly through these two scenarios of Chinese coercions vis-à-vis Taiwan. The first one is intensification of legal warfare. And by intensification of legal warfare, I mean what could take the form of enforcing differently the anti-secession law or enforcing some specific elements of China's national security legislation or pass some specific national security legislation for Taiwan. I think the form does not really matter. In Chinese law, the crimes of secession, collusion with a foreign state, or subversion are already defined. So it's more about politics than law. But we have a Hong Kong model there, which I think is an inspiration for China, as it thinks of possible ways to handle cross-strait relations. In practice, what would this mean? It would mean graven tactics targeting individuals and entities, even companies from Taiwan or from third parties. They would be highly vulnerable in China. There would be questions about their vulnerability in third countries. Actually, the European Court of Justice 2 years ago had a case against the extradition by Holland of the Taiwanese nationals to the PRC because of the risk of torture. So I don't think that extradition from Europe would be a huge risk for Taiwanese nationals, but it certainly would be a risk to be arrested for political crimes in third countries, for example. Cambodia comes to mind. The sign that something is cooking or that there is some thinking in that direction, to me, is that after the election in Taiwan, there was a statement, not by the Taiwan Affairs Office, but by the Ministry of State Security in China, that was very much in legal language with many references to the anti-secession law. So I think the Chinese thinking regarding using legal warfare is maturing vis-a-vis Taiwan. How would we have to respond to that? How should we respond to that? To me, the number one issue would be risk tolerance of various actors, European actors, international actors. Risk tolerance would need to be harmonized because if some individuals, some entities responded with panic in terms of severing their ties with Taiwan, this would actually amplify the effects that would be thought by China in doing so. Very quickly, because I'm constrained by time, going through the second scenario. My second scenario is a scenario of Chinese Coast Guards, law enforcement agencies crossing the 12 nautical miles zone, which China has never crossed before. China has a permanent presence in Taiwan's air defense identification zone, but it respects, in practice, the effective sovereignty of the ROC government in Taiwan over its airspace and territorial waters. There have been no open source cases of China crossing that line of 12 nautical miles zone. And why I think this deserves attention is because I believe that there has been a campaign in the Chinese media, signals sent to China's domestic audience, international audiences, that this is somehow the logical next step after China has established a presence in the air defense identification zone. Of course, doing so would spark a major crisis. The Taiwanese Defense Ministry has already made clear that an intrusion would be met by military means. But I think that what we can observe since January, February in the area, in the maritime areas around Kinmen, is going in that direction, even though Taiwan has never declared territorial waters and an airspace around Kinmen because it's too close to the mainland. How would we respond to that? How would we need to respond to that? One element that we can discuss is how to avoid that decision makers in Beijing assume that all one China policies will lead to a form of self-neutralization if China declares a law enforcement operation, legitimate law enforcement operation within one China. That is something that would be hard to address. And I think that we need to think about some international law language that could be used to justify a response to that sort of operations. We also need to think hard whether our one China policies give us enough space to respond to that sort of operation. That's the sort of thing we need to discuss. Final points to conclude. I think these two scenarios have one thing in common. That's the logic of effective administration. And I think this logic of effective administration has been a key tactic in China's maritime security playbook, just a kind of law enforcement fait accompli towards the Senkaku Islands in some areas of the South China Sea. So I think we have a playbook there, and a playbook that is characteristic of China's handling security issues in its periphery under Xi Jinping. And I think that's what we need to get ready for, some salami slicing, targeting Taiwan's effective and de facto sovereignty. I'll end here first. Thank you, Frédéric. Back.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. Let's turn now to Dr. Mark Harrison for his own view of what the scenarios are likely to be in the Taiwan Strait and the way Australia should respond.
Well, thanks very much for the invitation to speak from the National Security College, and thanks, Frédéric, for your introduction. Thanks to Mathieu for those really interesting comments, which I certainly agree completely with. I want to start just with a comment about the election results in January this year, which I think is interesting because the outcome was quite an equivocal outcome. For the Democratic Progressive Party to be returned to the presidency for a third time under Lai Ching-te is obviously really significant in terms of the effectiveness of the DPP as a political organization, as a professional party. The fact that the DPP lost its majority in the Legislative Yuan is also consequential. They did actually get the greatest number of total votes, but they got the votes in the wrong place, and so they didn't win a majority. I think it's important to think about domestic politics in Taiwan, and I think the election result can be read domestically as an expression by the electorate that they were quite satisfied with how the DPP had been managing Taiwan's foreign affairs and its defense and so on, but quite a significant dissatisfaction with domestic policy, with wage growth, housing, a whole range of domestic issues and economic management generally that the electorate was relatively dissatisfied by. And I think we've seen in the government that Lai Ching-te has already announced quite a strong domestic focus. The consequence of this is that I don't think is that we've never been able to do this in practice, but there's always been a tendency to reduce Taiwanese election outcomes to referendums on cross-strait relations. Now, that's very common around the world, but it's also something that Beijing has had a habit of doing, I think. So they look to see whether the KMT is doing well or the DPP is doing as well as a kind of pointer to whether or not unification is becoming more likely or less likely, and whether or not they're reading their policies as successes or failures. Such a complex result from the election just doesn't allow that kind of reading. And I think that's interesting in terms of the policy settings that we're seeing from Beijing. And I think what we've seen since the election is really nothing, not a structural change. We're seeing a continuity from the kinds of coercive policies that we saw before the election, of military pressure in particular. So they're obviously biding their time in Beijing. What I wanted to talk about, though, in the context of that was what we can say about decision-making in the PRC system and how we can read the kinds of decisions that Beijing makes for Taiwan, and essentially why it is that they're adopting these sorts of coercive, salami-slicing sort of pressure tactics when Beijing already has a military advantage. It's already got military superiority. So what exactly how can we read this sort of complex approach that Beijing has in terms of their goals? Obviously, the military balance is very complex. For Beijing to take control of Taiwan militarily is a huge undertaking. It's much more difficult for Beijing to take control of Taiwan than it is for Taiwan to stop them taking control of Taiwan. There's also the United States and so on. But what I'm interested in is the place that Taiwan has in the ideology of the PRC system. It's got a very strange place in the way Beijing understands the party, legitimacy of the system, all of those key features, and the way Taiwan is a metaphor for the future of China as a great power, as far as the party is concerned. It's easy. In order to continue to legitimize the authority of the party, it needs Taiwan in the future as part of that structure. It's a very strange place and a very distinctive place that Taiwan has in the PRC system. In other words, Beijing doesn't define Taiwan as a threat to it directly, but it defines it as the pathway through which Beijing will realize China's great rejuvenation, or the party will realize that. So you get this very paternalistic language, you get this incredibly threatening and strident language as well. It's a very complex architecture. Beijing does have a way of talking about Taiwan that provides ideological cover for its actions, and that is, it talks about separatists and foreign forces. It's very adamant that these are the elements that are taking Taiwan further away from unification and not closer. It's not taken that to the level where it has made the case that it must take direct action against Taiwan to save it from these forces. But I think overall, so in other words, there's the question of military balance, the preparedness, all of those really key features. But one of the ways we can understand these coercive measures is as a tactical, incremental, and escalatory because of the very distinctive place that Taiwan has in the PRC system, and the amount of ideological work that Beijing would actually have to do in order to justify to the people of China and itself a more direct action. Overall, this speaks, I think, to the nature of decision-making in the PRC and a system that's risk-averse in many ways, but also trapped by its own ideology, and leads to this kind of escalatory approach to Taiwan that doesn't actually address the fundamental issues with the fact that the Taiwanese people don't want to become part of the PRC. I think this points to a real failure in Beijing to properly understand the Taiwanese and understand their commitment to democracy and their commitment to self-determination, which of course go back to the beginning of the 20th century, to the 1910s and 20s. So you've got this sort of hyper-rational authoritarianism that's very hard for other countries to respond to. And the system itself is unable to address its own ideological failures. It can't really rethink policy at the level that's required. So we're all kind of stuck because of the way that the PRC system works. I will just make one final comment on this theme, which is that we saw a statement by the State Council and the Politburo at the end of last year about trying to promote integration between Fujian and Taiwan. And I think we're seeing some elements of that in the last couple of weeks with a visit by KMT officials to China. And they're trying to promote economic, social, and cultural integration with the premise that the Taiwanese people and the Fujian people they all share a common Minnan language and culture. So we're seeing that softer approach. None of this really addresses the gulf that exists between China and Taiwan. Just as a final point for Australia, obviously Australia's position, we've arrived at this idea of deterrence. So we're seeking to maintain a calculus in Beijing that more direct military action against Taiwan is inadvisable because there are sufficient forces sort of on the Taiwan side, as it were, with the United States and its allies that shift the calculus in Beijing in terms of their actions. I think that's an appropriate response given the consequences if Beijing actually took direct action against the Taiwanese. They'd be so devastating for Australia specifically. We're more exposed to this crisis almost than any other country in the world, or at least as much as any other country in the world. But I think we do need to be mindful in Australia of the distinctive place that Taiwan has in the PRC system and the distinctive nature of PRC policy making, and how we don't take actions that I hesitate to say that lead to greater escalation, because that sounds like we're deferring to Beijing's irrationality in this matter. But we do need to be conscious of the tremendously complex sort of calculus and the multiple moving parts that shape decision making in the region, and be more attentive, I think, to the domestic or the processes within Beijing that are driving this escalatory approach to Taiwan that they're on. And I'll stop there, but there's much more we can say.
Okay. Yes. I would say let's turn now to Suzanne Dietz-Anderson. Suzanne, you are a seasoned diplomat. You know China very well. How do you react to the kind of two approaches that we have heard so far vis-a-vis China's coercion on Taiwan? And what do you see, by the way, as Australia's option? Do you agree that this is mostly about deterrence? Are there other things that Australia could do? I mean, how do you approach the problem from your perspective?
Yeah, I essentially agree. There's really nothing more of true add-on value that I could contribute beyond what Mathieu and Mark have said. Yes, there's been increment. I think maybe for me the key points to underline, I guess, from what they have already said is that, you know, we're discussing China's use of coercion versus kinetic tools to try and change the status quo, but we have to recognize two things. It is changing the status quo, and it is doing so in an incremental and persistent fashion. And so I would tend, you originally posed a question to us, you know, what is more likely, gradual escalation of non-kinetic coercion or an outbreak of war? So I would respond that the preference is clearly the former, and that is what we've been seeing take place over the decades, as Mathieu said when he first started his discussion. And that incremental nibbling away of the silkworm on the leaf, as the Chinese like to use it, express it, rather than salami slicing, is definitely something that is very difficult to respond to, because it is incremental and there is nothing clearly strong enough. I mean, it would be very easy if they used military action, because then we would have something that we could see in a very concrete way and react to. But this kind of incremental coercion, incremental persuasion to change the status quo is very difficult for us, as well as other countries in the region, to react to. We've obviously been targets of China's economic coercion, but as one academic said in the recent past, what China is demonstrating on Taiwan and with Taiwan is the full range of coercion tools in its toolbox, all the way from the economic sanctions that we've talked about, disinformation, influence, cyber attacks, grey zone activity, psychological pressure, whether it's through military sorties or demonstration of what Taiwan might suffer under a blockade, and even shrinking Taiwan's international space. And as Mark said, it's not just about the shrinking list of countries that recognize Taiwan, but also reacting and describing what happens within Taiwan, including in its political activities, as something that's happening at subnational level and not seen as an entity in its own right trying to make decisions for itself. And that whole issue of the Taiwanese population's identity as Taiwanese versus a connection to the mainland beyond long cultural ties. That is something that the Chinese don't recognize fully enough, I don't think. And with all of these forceful as well as persuasive measures to try and persuade the Taiwanese that coming back to the mainland is going to be good for Taiwan, doesn't take into account the complexities on Taiwan itself, as Mark alluded to, where the identity that the population has now is very different to what it might have been 10 or even 15 years ago. So I think one of the main points I'd like to make is, yes, I agree with everything that both speakers have said so far. The potential consequences on the island, including increasing pro-PRC positions if there were to be increasing influence through the legislative processes on Taiwan, where the DPP is not in a clear majority. All of these sorts of incremental, subtle ways that the Chinese, that Beijing could exert influence within Taiwan, things that are very hard to pinpoint and very hard for external countries to respond to in any kind of decisive way in terms of persuading the PRC to change its actions. So I think we're facing quite a serious dilemma here, because in the end, if it does mean that there is over time a deterioration in the democratic vibrancy that is now characteristic of Taiwan, that would be a real blow for the continuity of the sorts of the kind of order that we would like to see in the region that entities like Taiwan do exemplify. And if it emboldens the Chinese to then look beyond Taiwan and think about more assertive actions elsewhere, whether it's in the South China Sea or in East China Sea or other places where they have territorial disputes, then that is something we really need to think about, because of the instability that would imply. And so when we think about deterrence versus assurance when it comes to our view on the status quo, we also have to think about the fact that the Chinese have their own version of deterrence and assurance too when it comes to Taiwan. So it's the kinds of policy responses we would have to think about it really quite complex and challenging. And I think Mark's final comments about thinking about the mindset within Beijing, that is going to make it even more complicated for us, because they're thinking about this in a way that is not the same way that we would be thinking about in terms of their historical legacy with Taiwan. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for your comments. So far, the debate seems to turn more or less on the inevitability of the Chinese grabs on Taiwan, one way or the other. Rory Metcalfe, is that a view that you share? How do you envisage this evolution of the situation in Taiwan Strait and the way Australia could react to it?
Well, look, thank you. Thank you very much, Frédéric, and it's great to be with you all in this virtual conversation. Before I begin, I would also really commend and thank you, Frédéric, for the work you're doing with this webinar series, building this bridge of strategic discussion between Australia and France, between Australia and Europe. This is one of the core issues, obviously, when we're thinking about the stability and security of the Indo-Pacific and the global implications thereof. I hope that in the conversation we don't look only at Australian responses, but we look also for the potential convergence of Australian and French, Australian and European responses, because I think that's international solidarity is going to be absolutely key to minimising the incentives for coercion and obviously minimising the incentives for conflict across the Taiwan Strait. So my starting point would actually be just to remind participants and the audience here what we're dealing with. What are the terms of the debate? What are the terms of the tensions across the Taiwan Strait? I like the point that was made already, I think, by Mark Harrison about a kind of ideological trap. The way in which, as many of us have seen it, I've certainly watched this over the last 20 or 30 years, the way in which the almost the symbolism of Taiwan as unfinished business from the Chinese Civil War has become more and more important in the discourse in Beijing and more important in defining the strategic objectives of Xi Jinping's China. And I think that's a real tragedy in many ways, because we're dealing with this very strange situation where the leadership of the PRC have effectively mortgaged the fate, the destiny, the prosperity, the security of 1.4 billion people on the need to subdue and coerce 23, 24 million people across the Taiwan Strait. Objectively speaking, of course, the prosperity and security of the people of the PRC doesn't depend on the need to subdue Taiwan. I think in many ways this ideological trap has tightened in the post-Tiananmen era. And unfortunately now, we do have decision makers and generations in the PRC that do identify with this imperative for reunification, if we can call it that. So the problem that leaves us with is, I think, a need to maintain the status quo and a need to literally on a daily basis build disincentives for coercion and obviously disincentives for conflict. And this is a task for many countries. Australia can play a small role or a middle power-sized role. And we probably do need to play a more significant role because, as has been pointed out, Australia is a country and an economy that's incredibly enmeshed with what happens in that part of the Indo-Pacific. But we need to work with as many partners as we can along that way. And I think it's really important, and this conversation's been very healthy in that regard so far, to also move away from the perception that everything that could go wrong across the Taiwan Strait, everything that could go wrong in a breakdown of stability is going to be due to the kind of structural tensions of US-China rivalry. which completely removes the agency of the Taiwanese people, and it completely removes the agency of the rest of us in the region and globally when it comes to the crunch. So let's have that sophisticated understanding, and I think we've made a good start there. We've talked a little bit about coercion, and it's important to think about what the playbook of coercive pressure from China looks like. I take the view that full-scale conflict is not inevitable, and it's interesting, even some of the voices that warn of full-scale conflict still recognise that it's a possibility rather than a certainty. We've seen, I think, in the last 2 years, a test run of a lot of the coercive activities, and in many ways, China's response to the visit by US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi a few years ago, I think 2 years ago, was that test run of coercive measures. So we know what is in Beijing's mind, and much of this is already happening. So simulating maritime blockade, but the potential actual enforcement of a maritime and or air blockade on the island of Taiwan. Electoral interference and pressure inside the political and electoral system of Taiwan. Already the election in January this year was a laboratory for disinformation and how to counter it as well. Cyber attacks, cyber infiltration, cyber pressure, economic coercion, again, in a selective way. And we've seen selective economic coercion before, but not comprehensive economic coercion. And of course, squeezing or eliminating Taiwan's little remaining diplomatic space internationally. So, there's a lot of coercion that can and does happen below the threshold of major conflict. The increasing assertive use of air and naval forces by China to effectively enter contested or indeed Taiwanese airspace and waters, test firing of weapons in coercive ways. All this has been done already. So in many ways, the challenge is to set not so much red lines, but really signals or markers as to what is unacceptable behaviour, what is behaviour that will destabilise the regional security situation so much and coerce Taiwan so much that effectively the economic and security interests of all of us are threatened. I think a conversation needs to begin, and I think between Australia and Europe, with Japan ideally as well, and of course the United States as part of that conversation. But we can do this. We can do this in a set of strands on our own. A conversation about economic deterrence, about what are the economic measures that would happen in response to different gradations of coercion. Now, to be honest, a country like Australia with this massive trade dependence or trade relationship in certain industries with China is not going to suddenly start waving a playbook of economic deterrence publicly when it comes to different scenarios. But the basic signal that business as usual cannot continue, not because of even a policy choice, but because of the risk assessments by the private sector, that needs to be reinforced at every stage. And I think, it's great to be having this track 2 conversation, but if there's not already very frank and sophisticated government-to-government dialogue, track 1 dialogue among, for example, Australia and the EU, or Australia and Japan, or Europe and Japan, that needs to be happening, and it needs to be happening now. There's a few other things that I would throw into the mix before I pause and let the conversation proceed, and that is to think about what are some of the options that we can explore to basically try to bolster Taiwan's resilience on a day-to-day basis without crossing provocative thresholds, without crossing the kind of diplomatically, the ultimate diplomatically provocative threshold, i.e. treating or recognising Taiwan as a state in the international system. And there's a lot that can be done in a positive grey zone of cooperation So, for example, that would actually try and strengthen the resilience of Taiwan and its ability to resist coercive pressure and its ability to help maintain a status quo that is peaceful and that is supporting the prosperity of the region. We're seeing a little bit of this happening, but I do think there probably is too much timidity on the part of the Australian government at the moment, and that's not a new thing. It's been quite a frequent thing over the years when it comes to Taiwan, but I think that we can be more creative within the envelope of a so-called one China policy, which is not the same as Beijing's one China principle, as Mark Harrison and others know very well. So dialogue that isn't purely of a kind of academic and think tank kind, much more regular and creative use of parliamentary dialogue and engagement, and there has been some quite good parliamentary dialogue recently. The idea of minilateralising parliamentary dialogue and engagement with Taiwan, it doesn't have to be any one country that is engaging with Taiwan in a political sense, in a parliamentary sense at any time. We have safety in numbers. If, for example, we saw coordination of Australian and European delegations, or perhaps coordination with Japanese or other delegations. There's a lot that can be done through the education and training space. There is, in fact, a not particularly well-known minilateral arrangement of Australia, Japan, the United States and Taiwan that is a global training and education a cooperation arrangement. It's been in place, I think, for about 9 years. Australia joined a few years ago, and that can and is used as a platform for really sharing experience through training and education that can help build Taiwan's own resilience. So, for example, in areas like national disaster response that we've had here in Australia, or preparedness in Taiwan, you could be looking at ways to prepare civil society for all kinds of shocks. And of course, those shocks could be the terrible natural disasters that both Australia and Taiwan experience, but those shocks could also be about preparing a civilian society and economy for a more confronting strategic environment. And again, none of this needs to be bilateral. The more that we can work in diverse company across the liberal democratic world, the better. And of course, given that Europe is learning about or relearning about strategic preparedness itself at the moment in response to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, there could well be some pretty powerful European lessons that could be shared with Taiwan in that regard as well. So I'm going to pause there at the moment just to sort of conclude that on 2 points. One is that all of this is going to require more forthrightness in our diplomacy, and that forthrightness is not going to come in a unilateral way. It's going to have to proceed in a carefully coordinated way with others. The fact is that Australia is in this phase of stabilisation in relations with China. And as we all know, our system is going to be careful when it comes to the language it uses around Taiwan. But on issues like, for example, coercive behaviour or cyber intrusions, the more that we can proceed in good company, in good diplomatic company, the better. And then last of all, everything I've said doesn't discount the reality that the really hard issue here is really a strategic level of deterrence. It's about preventing military aggression either beginning or escalating. And that's where, along with the more creative use of diplomacy I've been talking about, it does make sense for Australia and others to keep building the kinds of military capabilities we need to discourage conflict in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henri. I mean, a lot of, not so many differences actually, but a lot of different angles. I'd like to remind the audience, yes, you can start writing your question in the chat box and they will be read to the speakers. But before we get to that, I'd like to ask you both, Mathieu and Rory, to elaborate a little bit on what seems to be a point of convergence on the need to use also the business sector. Rory, you mentioned the fact that this is not through economic sanction, but it is going to be through the risk assessment of the business sector, something that you seem to agree with, Mathieu, but correct me if I'm wrong, when you speak of the need to demonstrate resilience, not panic vis-a-vis what China measure is. How feasible is harmonization of the risk assessment by the business sector, as you mentioned, Mathieu, and what role the business sector is actually capable of doing in that line? I mean, we're all familiar with economic sanction. This is an angle that you're both taking, which is slightly less usual, and I'd like you to develop a little bit if possible. Let's start with you, Mathieu, perhaps.
Yes, okay. The EU is the first foreign investor in Taiwan. European companies are present in some key sectors of the Taiwanese economy. Some important European companies are part of the semiconductor supply chains on key materials. I'm thinking of ASML or Air Liquide. European companies are also present in the Taiwanese energy sector, which is particularly vulnerable to coercion. So I think the starting point here is really that European companies are part of the strategic picture. And here there are different ways to look at the problem or as to whether European companies can be part of some solution. I think from the problem side, the private sector could be a target of coercion or could be collateral damage when it comes to coercive moves by the PRC vis-a-vis Taiwan. And this is why risk tolerance harmonization is particularly important. I'll give you one example. When I was conducting the interviews for my reports, I spoke to a very big European company's chief security executive visiting Taiwan, who basically said, the risk of crisis in the Taiwan Strait is very high in the context of the Taiwanese election. Why don't I suggest to my expatriates based in Taiwan that they should stay in Europe after Christmas and see what happens after the election and during the period of the Chinese New Year's? Because companies tend to see risks from the angle of evacuate or not evacuate. That's how it's built in their standard operation procedures. And of course, it was an excessive assessment of risk in the Taiwan Strait. But just imagine if that particular company had proceeded with that view. I think this would have triggered some sort of not panic effect, but this would not have been lost on the Taiwanese media, and there would have been, political consequences after the decision of one single company. I think that's why it's very important to conduct public-private exchanges regarding specific risks of Chinese coercive moves vis-a-vis Taiwan, precisely avoid that kind of outcome. And then the second element is what Rory mentioned when he spoke of positive gray zone in many areas of Taiwan's resilience. And I'm thinking in particular of the energy sector, but also the semiconductor supply chain, where European companies are already present and where there have been important investments and where there are important stakes for Taiwan and for themselves going forward. Take ASML. There was a major investment in Taiwan to increase the scale of the EUV machines assembly line. Taiwan is the only place other than the Netherlands where ASML assembles EUV machines. And we know that they are very strategic in the semiconductor supply chain. So all those private investment decisions have a important effect on Taiwan's resilience. And one negative way to look at it would be that we should avoid making things worse in case there is a sudden increase of pressure by the Chinese side. But the positive way to look at it, the positive gray zone, is to encourage a steady commitment to Taiwan as an economic and technological partner. And finally, the third area is sanctions. We are not there yet. It's a very difficult discussion in Europe to think of a blueprint. There have been discussions going on among EU member states. It takes us very far in terms of describing and understanding European politics. To cut this long story short, I will just say that I don't think that the EU is the correct interlocutor for Australia on this particular issue, because there are several states that would not be part of a economic response to an act of coercion by China. So I think the right way to look at it is coalitions of states, some European states, definitely France, looking at what are the economic sanctions options to respond to an act of coercion by China. I know that this is highly sensitive. I know that most states want to discuss this in a very low-key manner. I think low-key is probably the right way to go about it. There have been discussions, actually, whether in the US, whether some of the possible sanctions could be communicated in advance to the Chinese side, so that they have a deterrence effect on some of the actions that China should take. My understanding of the view in Europe is that this should definitely be conducted in a low-key manner. And here, there is a private sector element which is extremely central to the whole conversation. If you take the Russia sanctions blueprint, the presence of foreign companies in Russia has been a key weakness for Russia, a key vulnerability, and an important element of the European response. So to me, the right format is coalition of states and some of the key companies that should be part of the conversation.
Jorge, how would you answer the same question?
Yeah, look, thank you. So jumping in on that, look, firstly, I certainly wasn't proposing that some heroic companies are going to somehow, be the sacrifices and sort of declare, if you like, their set of economic or commercial measures that they would take in the event of a conflict. Of course, corporate actors are going to be cautious and careful and will be making their profits for as long as they generally can. But having said that, I think that point about the risk awareness and the risk mentality in the private sector is the sort of secret ingredient here. It's not betraying any confidences to say that, I've seen in recent years quite a large number of companies in the Australian private sector who acknowledge that they are looking at scenarios, that they're looking at their risk profile in the event of crisis or even conflict across the Taiwan Strait. They're being prudent. And, I'm sure that similar things are happening in Europe, similar things are happening in a lot of the global economy. There must be a way to basically weaponize that message without companies saying that they would unilaterally take any sort of actions, but to make clear that message, particularly to the leadership in Beijing, that a lot of the private sector on which investment and even now advanced technology transfer depends would have to effectively end business as usual, even in scenarios short of outright conflict. The signalling of that could come via governments, it could come via industry peak bodies or industry groups, so that no individual company is going to be the target, if you like, of Beijing's displeasure. The consular issue is really important as well. I'm really glad that Mathieu raised that, because the risk thinking of companies, and I know there are others on this call, Susan and others who have a much closer visibility of the private sector in their careers than I do. But I think the consular risk to staff and executives is something that's increasingly seriously thought about. And this isn't just executives or staff based in Taiwan; it's based in China as well, because if conflict were to escalate, it's not as if the Chinese mainland would somehow be, off the map as a potential target or danger zone. And this isn't just finally Australian and European companies as well. It's interesting to think about how the business community in Southeast Asia is starting to think about Taiwan scenarios. It's no secret that hundreds of thousands of Southeast Asian nationals are resident in Taiwan for work and other purposes. And so the governments of those countries, which generally want to sit on the fence and avoid taking an open position on Taiwan Strait issues, actually know that they would have an impossible consular task on their hands if things were to move closer to conflict. Again, there must be a way of helping and encouraging those governments to send the message to Beijing, not don't do this coercive thing against Taiwan, but don't do this thing that will put our own nationals at risk. So I think this is the beginning of a fruitful conversation. And in a way, low-key is fine, but as long as there is a general public awareness that the conversation is seriously happening.
Thank you very much, Howie. Before we turn to the audience, I'd like to ask you, Susan, to react to that discussion, because you're the only one in the panel who has actually been working in the private sector and therefore probably have an opinion how the business react to risk when it comes to China.
Look, a couple of things in terms of risk assessments. We've seen examples of how companies have started to think about risk, not only for the security of their teams, but also how their company's business security is going to be perpetuated in light of geopolitical risk. And more and more companies are becoming aware of that. And from my experience, I've seen it directly in terms of how the operating environment in China has become very challenging, and the responses to the prolonged lockdown because of COVID and the freezing up of the economy and normal business routines had a very strong, very a singular effect on how companies thought about their longevity in China and the longevity of their executives in China. So what I'm leading to is, my point is that there has to be a conversation between government and business to educate both sides on what each side thinks about risk. Because to be frank, in my narrow experience, I'm not saying I know all there is when it comes to business attitudes, but when it comes to thinking about how to think about making sure that Beijing is disincentivized to go down that military path, the path of increased conflict. I think that companies will be more concerned about issues when they look like they're leading to that stage versus all of the other coercive tools that Beijing has in its playbook, if it does not affect them. And if it's affecting supply chain integrity and they can't think of alternatives, then they might be more interested in having the conversation. If it's about security of personnel, then they will be interested in having that conversation. But to me, there's a sense of thinking about in terms of potential scenarios that are unlikely versus scenarios that are likely. And so you will have, I think there will be a challenge in when it comes to creative diplomacy, as Rory was talking about, in having business and government on the same page all the time. And it will require a lot of work to make both sides understand what each side's interests are in all the scenarios that we've been talking about today when it comes to how China is thinking about and acting upon Taiwan.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let's now turn to the audience with a question of Sarajit Parmar. Let me take the opportunity to say that I'm glad that we'll watch from India as well. And the question is for you, Mark. What are the chances that China may just wait out and let the strategic dilemma continue while it looks at option to quietly absorb Taiwan without a conflict scenario?
It could try that, but it's not going to work. There's no scenario where the people of Taiwan are going to wake up one day and say, you know what, let's become a province of the People's Republic of China. The histories have diverged for such a long time. It's well over a century, right from the beginning of the 20th century, where you see those early efforts by the Taiwanese to pursue self-determination and democracy under Japanese colonial rule. It's just such a long time. And so unfortunately, Beijing I don't think Beijing really thinks that it can wait out the Taiwanese and they'll eventually come back. That's why they continue to apply this pressure. But that just isn't going to happen. And it will take Beijing taking much more direct action against the Taiwanese to essentially force them to accept unification, which obviously is a disaster for everybody.
Thank you very much. Another question, and I remind the audience that you can still write in your question in the chat box so we can continue this discussion. The question is from Sophie Amel, and what is the role of Pacific Island countries in the US-Australian strategy toward China and Taiwan? So it's a question for one of the three of you, Rory, Suzanne, and Mark. Who would like to answer first?
Well, it would be nice to have someone from the Pacific to answer the question. I have something to say on it, but I'm happy to wait for others first.
Suzanne?
Look, when it comes to the interests of the Pacific Island countries, they are looking at, I'm going to generalize, but this is, just for the sake of time, but there's a general, when Pacific Islands look out at the world and think about their priorities, they're not thinking about the geopolitical competition first. They're thinking about other issues that are closer to home, and some are in fact existential, like climate change, obviously. So when they look out and see what some have described to me as the clash of the titans, in some ways they are regretful that this is happening, because it can be to their detriment, because there will be issues about the sorts of development needs that are going to be satisfied by one country or the other at the expense of one country or the other's good graces. And it also means that and on the other hand, they are also able to take advantage of this competition to gain the attention for investment, for development, for climate change cooperation that they might not otherwise get so readily and so quickly. So I think there are different reasons why the Pacific Islands have differing attitudes towards the geostrategic competition. Some would like to benefit from it and are taking advantage, and some would like more attention paid genuinely on their needs.
And precisely, this is why the question is highly relevant, because if you do so, how do you as Australia react to this, and what is your range of option in this regard?
I think we should be much more engaged in the country's needs. We are already, obviously, but that persistent, more active engagement with and responsiveness to what their fundamental challenges and what their priorities are would go a long way.
Mark, would you like to try to give an answer to that question?
Yeah, I'll just add that obviously we've seen competition in the Pacific over diplomatic recognition between Beijing and Taipei, which has mostly gone Beijing's way. I think particularly when Solomon Islands switched recognition in 2019, I think an understanding that switching recognition to Beijing was really just created a gateway to further and further integration and more complex security dilemmas for the region, and particularly Australia, has become much more foregrounded in policy in Canberra. So I think there's a recognition these days that relations between China and Taiwan in the Pacific has broader implications than simply diplomatic recognition. And as Susan said, it requires much more proactive engagement by big countries like Australia in the region. I think we have seen that, but it expresses a recognition that the China-Taiwan story plays out in complicated and not always fully predictable ways around the region and indeed around the world.
Thank you very much, Rory. Let me come back to you and ask you about another aspect of the question which hasn't been answered so far, which is the question seems to assume a sort of identity between US and Australian strategy toward China and Taiwan. Maybe this is overreading it. How do you react to this? And could you clarify that point, please?
Sorry, can you
explain
again? I didn't quite understand the alignment of the US and Australian position.
The question seems to assume sort of an identity between US and Australian strategies. Is that a reality? How would you react to that part of the question?
Yeah, no, fair enough. No, look, I think there is a distinctively Australian approach on Taiwan, and in a way, having this conversation is, I hope, helping to inform and shape that. It's not identical to the US position. It's very clearly not. But I think that I think the appetite in Australia, we've seen it for many years. We've seen it, for at least the last 20 years. There's been always a kind of a caution, a focus on stability, less, if you like, rejoicing in the democratic character of Taiwan, but a respect for the democratic character of Taiwan, just a greater focus on stability above all. However, when you look at the strategic level of power politics in the Indo-Pacific, Australia has a deep interest in preventing regional hegemony by China. Australia has a deep interest in deterring an act of military aggression or an act of grey zone aggression that could not only upset the status quo, but perhaps be the first in a number of activities in the region. And that's where I think Australian and American, Australian and US interests converge. So I think in a sense, Australia has an opportunity to help the Americans with what are sometimes the rough edges of their strategic diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific. Where we have to be careful, though, is not allowing either China or those voices that privilege a PRC perspective to create the illusion that somehow Australia has no interest in the security and self-determination of Taiwan, whereas somehow America has an overwhelming interest in that as a proxy for their own dominance. And so this much more subtle conversation we're trying to have today, I think, is part of that journey.
Again, that looks very much like Mathieu's assertion that actually one of the risks for Europe, for example, is to let China believe that the one China policy that we all share will neutralize any attitude vis-a-vis China. We will have a question for you, Mathieu. The question is coming from Denise Fisher. And would Europe's response to heightened coercion by China of Taiwan differ to that of the US? I tend to believe you have somehow responded so far, but perhaps you could elaborate on this.
Yes, I made a point about intra-EU division, and I can elaborate a little bit on that. Some of you may know that within the EU, Council, so when foreign ministers meet or when heads of states of governments meet, there's always one country that prevents the Taiwan issue from just being placed on the agenda of the discussions, and that's Cyprus. So the EU has a very specific Cyprus problem when it comes to Taiwan and cross-strait relations. You are referring to the distinction between the one China policy and the one China principle. Well, Cyprus is the country within the European Union that sticks to the one China principle. So if you want to reach an intra-EU cohesion with regards to anything related to Taiwan and cross-strait relations, I think the Cyprus problem needs to be solved first. That's one element of the response. And I said that as a result of that, but also, I mean, there are all other specific positions, specific approaches to China and Taiwan within the European Union. That's the most obvious one. It would be very difficult to reach a kind of US-EU united front on any Taiwan crisis scenario. But it doesn't mean that the US would not be able to include several, if not many, EU member states in a coalition. Everything depends on the specific circumstances. I think I should probably make a comment here on France, because France is an interesting case. On the one hand, France is the only EU member states which maintains some form of defense cooperation with Taiwan as a result of the arms contracts from the early 90s. And France is also the only EU member states that regularly has its Navy sail in the Taiwan Strait. And that actually has created in the past frictions with China, including last year when President Macron visited China. There was this very interesting case, if you're interested in China's disinformation playbook, during which just simultaneous to the visit, a French frigate sailed in the Taiwan Strait. And at the time, there were many articles in the PRC media, but also on the Taiwanese media, arguing that the French frigate had been authorized by the Chinese Navy to sail on the western side of the median line, so the one more or less controlled by the PRC, without being shadowed, which was complete disinformation. In fact, there were frictions between that particular ship and the Chinese ships that were shadowing her. But yes, to make this shorter, there is some degree of French contribution to freedom of navigation in the Taiwan Strait and some degree of French contribution to the Taiwanese military. On the other hand, you had the comments by President Macron last April in his plane back from China after the state visit, during which he said that some of the tensions in the Taiwan Strait were caused by the United States, and that Taiwan was not our crisis. I think that's the term he used, not our crisis. And of course, this created a lot of controversy not only in the French media, in the European media as well. Here, just two things to put these comments in perspective. First, the explanation that you hear now is that the key point was about our lack of leverage to decisively influence outcomes in the Taiwan Strait, which I think is kind of fair. That was the point, in the back of his mind, apparently. And the other thing is, just to put things in perspective, 2023 was a peak when it comes to visits of key Taiwanese officials to France, including the economy minister. She was in France again 2 weeks ago. Each time there is pressure from the Chinese side to get those visits cancelled, by threatening to cancel other visits by PRC officials. Each time France has been firm, and those visits have taken place, and there have been no consequences. So, it's very hard to predict what would be the transatlantic dynamic in a Taiwan Strait crisis. My basic stance is that France is among European countries, one of the countries that is the most likely to support the US response to a crisis. Maybe, Frédéric, you have comments about that.
This is not my role to give comments here, but I tend to agree with what you just said. Let me come back to your comments about Cyprus for a second, because yes, Cyprus is a problem, and but at the same time, is Cyprus the problem, or is Cyprus also, to use a French phrase, l'arbre qui cache la forêt, the alibi for a number of other European states not to act on China?
I don't know each of the debates in the 27 member states, but I think there's really no appetite to play a greater role in the Taiwan Strait in any of the capitals. And you could detect a sense of urgency from the visit of Pelosi to Taiwan until the Taiwanese election. And the issue has really subsided after the elections, when many concluded that very obviously, in the short term at least, and that's something we have not discussed yet. I think all the trends that we are discussing now are trends that can be kind of predicted until the elections in the United States. I think the Chinese policy towards Taiwan now is a policy that is being conducted in the framework of this last year of the Biden administration. And what comes next, when you listen to Chinese interlocutors, is very unclear, to be honest. So no, I think Cyprus is an extreme case within the EU context. But Cyprus is not the only reason why the process that had been started by the External Action Service to engage with the 27 member states in contingency planning has stopped. Actually, it was something that was very difficult to conduct. And I think that reinforces my point that only coalitions of European countries would be a relevant interlocutors for the US and Japan and other countries that seek to respond to contingencies in the Taiwan Strait.
Thank you very much. I think it would be fair also to recall that, this is not a fixed situation. And if you look at European decisions over the past few years, we have seen a stream of decisions were made, the screening mechanism and so on and so forth. And for whoever looks at the newspaper, there is a series of spying scandals today in Europe, which is unprecedented and related to China. So there is a growing reaction to what China is doing. Time is running fast, and we are approaching the end of this conversation. So let me ask you all to speak for about 2 minutes and give you a final thought about this conversation as to what your respective country could and should do in this regard, and perhaps more importantly as well, what are the field of convergence between the two, partly from your own experience, partly from what our discussion today. Let's start with you, Mark. How do you see, where do you see the convergence? Where do you see the difference, and what could be done with regard to China over Taiwan?
Look, I'd broadly say that there are so many moving parts to this relationship that it is by definition unpredictable. Beijing is applying more and more pressure, and that generates more and more energy in the dynamics of cross-strait relations. I would make it positive. I guess, a slightly optimistic concluding comment, which is, I think one of the really big developments in Australia to manage and to think about this relationship is Australia's really made a lot of progress over the last decade, particularly the last 5 years, in having a better understanding of Taiwan, in having a more acute capacity to recognize the granularity of the dynamics, as it were, to really have quite a good read on different events and how they sit within the broader dynamic. So I think in years gone by, there wasn't a lot of understanding about Taiwan's position on these issues. A lot of things have led to this point, but broadly speaking, I think Australia is much better placed than it has been in years gone by to think and debate and talk about Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. And at the end of the day, if there's a crisis, the nature of that, by definition, will require a deep understanding to calibrate any responses that the Australian government has in coordination with friends and allies. And you can't do that unless you kind of have a good read on exactly what the story is. And I feel that I've seen over the last decade gradually a much better understanding of the Taiwan story in Australia, and that informs the kinds of politics and the kinds of decision-making that we've been seeing.
Thank you very much, Mark. Susan?
Yes, I'd agree with Mark. I think, especially in the recent past, the experiences we've had in our relationship with China and the punitive measures that they imposed on us on the economic side had a salutary effect on many segments of the Australian community, and I think it's helped us to be much more realistic about the kind of relationship we want to have with China. And the question about Taiwan comes into that as well. What I would say is that, and this is kind of riffing off what Rory was talking about in terms of potential ways to build Taiwan's resilience, I think there's a real value in having more conversations with different parts of the Australian community, whether it's business, whether it's the diaspora, whether it's other parts of the population, politicians as well, to think through and to get all the different perspectives that are out there on, what this might mean for Australia's security and Australia's well-being. Because if there's greater understanding of the less subtle and the more obvious ways in which China is trying to change the status quo across the strait, then I think we have a much better ability to think through the sorts of policies that we need to employ to protect our interests, and whether that means more engagement with other partners, whether it means a much clearer understanding of the issues and the risks within the Australian community. I think that would stand us in good stead.
Thank you very much, Susan. Please, Rory.
Look, thanks. I think I'm going to recapitulate with some of the themes I had at the beginning, but just to build on what we've heard this evening, and that is that solidarity among other liberal democracies that not only have that sense of shared values, and let's face it, if you look at values sense, there's a very, very strong alignment between Australia and Europe in wanting to see not only liberal democracy preserved, but small and middle power liberal democracy preserved, but also making sure that solidarity is not simply government to government, that we can actually engage more of civil society, the private sector, the education sector in that engagement. And of course, none of this is going to, on its own, deter major war. We need the hard power as well. But I think that much healthier web of engagement with not only with Taiwan, but with one another is going to help create that shared awareness that actually makes coercion harder to sustain and makes conflict that little bit less likely. Interesting point that I'll take away from this for my own further research. I mean, Matthew's point about the difficulties of engaging the EU as an actor on this is something I'll consider. I, to be honest, I wasn't aware of the Cyprus roadblock quite so sharply. So thank you for that. There's at least one other EU member that I tend to think of when I think of the difficult player in the room on balancing against Chinese power. But I'd also just conclude with a point that we can't have this conversation without thinking about how to bring other Asian partners into a web of solidarity as well. We've talked a little bit about Japan. It's interesting to think about what South Korea's interests are. It's interesting to think a little bit about whether there's any progress we can make with Southeast Asian partners or with India, all to send that message that, sure, the status quo has various political and diplomatic imperfections, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative. We have to keep focus on this issue. Thank you.
And Mathieu, for the last word.
Yes, very quickly, three quick points. I think first, be aware that some of the actions that we could take or some of the rhetoric that we could use could actually make things worse. And I think we need to start with the awareness that some reactions to Chinese actions can actually amplify their effects. I think it's a very important element when thinking about Taiwanese security. The second point, going back to my 12 nautical miles zone scenario, I think it would be worth to explore the possibility for agreeing on some international law language to use to better legitimize policy responses to contingencies in the Taiwan Strait. I'm aware that this discussion has taken place to some extent between France and Germany, but has not led to a conclusion yet. Maybe that's something for Australia as well. Finally, I think the whole discussion for me is really leading to the notion of economic security policies for all actors that are, adjusting their relations with China in the context of geopolitical risk. And I think that here we should not think of the Taiwanese economy as an economy from which we should cut ourselves to manage risks to our national economies or to the interest of specific companies. I think China will want us to move in that direction, and it's important to be aware of that intention to resist that possibility and to resist that trend.
Thank you, Mathieu, and thank you very much to all of you. I think the audience will agree with me that it's been a very rich conversation, and certainly a conversation to be continued because we only scratched part of the surface of the question. It's now time to bring this session to a close. So again, thank you all. Thank you for the audience for being so with so large a number this evening, and our next meeting will be sometime at the end of June. Stay with us, stay with Indo-Pacific Partners, and good evening to everybody.